Good evening. My name is Lori Buckle with my husband Andrew behind the camera, and we are here on behalf of our production company, Beautiful Terrors. Tonight, I want to talk about a subject that I have wanted to talk about for years. Holy goosebumps. But first, let's have a little introduction. Several years ago, I read an article in Christianity Today talking about alternatives for Halloween. And this lady who wrote it talked about how she and her family would have a party so that her kids could invite their friends over. Only instead of a traditional Halloween party, everything that they did was biblically themed. So, for example, one of the games the kids would play would be hide and seek out in the backyard with all the lights turned off so it was nice and dark. Instead of calling it hide and seek, however, this lady would call it Romans versus Christians, so that the kids who were hiding had to pretend to be Christians in underground catacombs in their hidden churches, and whoever was a nasty Roman soldier coming to find them. And then after the game, she would sit down with the kids and tell them the story behind why they called it this. And so every game and activity that they did would have some sort of biblical theme to it. And then at the end of the night, with their bags of candy, she would make sure to give them tracts or Bibles or something to take home with them. Well, this got my imagination fired up. What were some other alternatives to Halloween? What are some creative ways that we could present the gospel message in our 21st century world for Halloween? Well, one thing that Andrew and I share in common is that we are both science geeks. Well, I got to thinking, what is the basis for Halloween? Fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of bad things happening. So, how can we substitute that? How can we turn that around? Well, you know, there's a lot of fear in the Bible. And a lot of that fear is of God. The fear of the Lord, that phrase appears throughout the Bible, and especially in the New Testament. So I started thinking, what can we do with the fear of the Lord? And then it occurred to me, usually when that phrase is used in the Bible, there's somebody besides the human, besides the hero, there's somebody else in that story, somebody who's the reason for that fear that the hero or heroine is suffering. And that's when I got the idea for holy goosebumps. First, however, I need to set the stage, so please be patient with me. Andrew and I are science geeks, so I need to talk about some science for just a moment, but I promise this will be painless. In fact, this will actually be fun. All right, here we go. You know, in the Bible, heroes are often people who don't want to be called. They're very reluctant and don't want to do what God asked them. And oftentimes, that occurs in the modern era as well. People who have changed history often just kind of ran into it and didn't ask to be called out as heroes. Well, the hero of our story was the same way. Georges Riemann. I hope I pronounced that correctly. If you're a scientist out there and I messed that up, please accept my apologies. Riemann lived in the first half of the 19th century in Germany. He was very shy and devoutly religious. In fact, he wanted to be a minister. His family was poor, and he wanted to help them by becoming a minister and using his salary to help his family. Well, the thing was, Georges loved math, and so he couldn't help but taking his passion and trying to put it into his religion. So he started playing around with the Bible and trying to prove how the events in Genesis were mathematically possible. Fortunately, his family had the wisdom to see that becoming a minister was really not George's calling. So they scraped up the money and sent him to the University of Göttingen. And again, I'm sorry if you're a native German and I messed that up. Please accept my apologies. But they sent him off to university to study mathematics instead. While he was there, he became the protege of Friedrich Gauss, who even today is considered one of the greatest mathematicians of all time. You talk about pressure. Well, Gauss charged his protege that I want you to give a public lecture. And I want you to give it on a subject called the foundation of geometry. In other words, he wanted Riemann to prove that there was a geometry outside of what was being taught in the textbooks. He wanted Riemann to overturn 2,000 years worth of teaching. Again, no pressure here. You see, ever since the ancient times, now if you took geometry in high school, you will know where I'm going with this. Ever since the ancient times, the ancient Greeks who invented geometry had taught that there's only 3 dimensions. A dot, a line, a square. That's it. Just 3 dimensions. And for reasons that are too complex to go into here. That was the received wisdom for 2,000 years. The Greeks said it. That had to be it. Some people speculated that there might be more, but they were a tiny minority. And in fact, in 1685, a British mathematician named John Wallis had called the idea of extra dimensions a monster in nature, impossible. Quote, length, breadth, and thickness take up the whole of space. Nor can fancy imagine how there should be a 4th local dimension beyond these 3. Unquote. That's it. It's done. Nothing more to be said. Until the 1850s and Gauss and Riemann. Now we should add something here. Gauss believed that there were more dimensions, but he was afraid to say so. He had his position to consider. Since the majority of opinion said Euclid was right, Ptolemy was right, there are only 3 dimensions, he couldn't say that there might be more. So he just told a student to do it for him. So Riemann, who really did not want to do this, who was petrified of getting up and speaking in public, much less about such a controversial subject, agreed to do so. And after much research, he found his breakthrough. Now, in his private writings, Gauss had speculated about what if there were a 2-dimensional world, just like a piece of paper, and creatures living on it, just crawling, moving along. Of course, they wouldn't be aware of anything else like us in the 3rd dimension. But as I said, Gauss was afraid to push it any further because he had his position and his reputation to consider. But Riemann had not much to lose, and so he started thinking and pushing. And then he realized, what if you crumpled that paper up? Now, this little creature who was on the paper is now on the inside here somewhere, but he's still on the paper. He's still within that 2-dimensional plane. So he doesn't know everything's crumpled up. This poor little creature is just trying to crawl along. And all he knows is, oh, Lord, this is hard trying to get around here. Yeah, what is the deal? Because all he can do is see around him and ahead and behind him. He can't see that his world is crumpled up. So Gauss then, pardon me, Riemann pushed that further and said, what if our world is like this? What if our universe, our 3rd-dimensional universe, is like this in the 4th dimension? And we can't experience it because we're just here in our third dimension. But if everything is crumpled up, well, then all the scientific laws make sense. You see, before he was charged with this mathematical task, Riemann had been studying scientific laws, such as gravity, trying to figure out how they actually work. Newton had posited the mathematical formula of how to calculate gravity, but he didn't explain how it actually worked. Outside, there's a lovely moon, and you've all heard that the moon affects the tides, but how? The moon's up there, the ocean's down here. What's going on between them that makes that actually? Newton didn't have any idea. He just said, it works. Just deal with it. It works. Well, that wasn't good enough for Riemann. Now he said, if we're crumpled up in the fourth dimension, that's what's going on. Those physical laws are our universe crumpled up. Forces like electricity, magnetism, and gravity are a result of our universe in another dimension that we can't see or realize that's there. Within science and mathematics, this caused a revolution. In the early 1900s, Einstein would build on this for his theories of relativity. Today, physicists, many of them posit that there's even more, that there's 10 dimensions. But let's go back to poor Riemann. So he delivers his lecture. It's a nice theoretical construct, but people are like, okay, yeah, whatever. It's a nice theoretical construct. And then it happened. In 1877, Henry Slade, an American psychic, came to England plying his trade. And he was a very good psychic, so people flocked to his seances and his readings and whatnot. Well, unfortunately, he was so popular that the authorities said, nah, this has got to end. You must be a fraud. That's against the law. You're arrested. And that would have been it. Another psychic debunked. Except Johann Zollner, professor of physics at the University of Leipzig, declared he's not a fraud. Everything that he does is perfectly possible. There's this mathematical construct called the fourth dimension. All the stuff that Slade is doing is perfectly possible in this extra dimension. Oh my goodness. It exploded because suddenly there's this raging debate. Some physicists actually went with Zollner. Some people who would go on to win Nobel Prizes sided with Zollner and said, oh yeah, this fourth dimension thing, yeah, it's perfectly possible to do all this weird stuff. Other scientists were like, he's a fraud. You people, he's a fraud. Everything he does can be explained away. And this spilled over into the media, and people were like, what is going on? Could it really be? If you're old enough to remember Uri Geller and his exploits, this is exactly what was happening 100 years ago. So this pushed the fourth dimension into the popular mind, and suddenly the idea exploded. In case you're wondering, the courts didn't believe in the fourth dimension stuff, and Slade was busted, found guilty. But the idea caught on. It exploded. Other dimensions, unseen, all around us. Because other things were going on at the same time. Science was exploding. We were discovering that there's little particles called atoms, molecules. Why, you can bombard a human body with these things and see right through the human body. You don't have to cut them open anymore. Amazing discoveries. And so if there's unseen particles, why couldn't there be unseen dimensions? Well, it didn't take long before the church jumped on board with this. We've only been saying this for 2,000 years, right? Of course there are unseen realms all around us. Heaven, God, demons, angels. Even Paul says we're surrounded by a cloud of witnesses. Not floating on a cloud, some of them up there playing harps, surrounded by a cloud of witnesses. Well, science is just catching up. And in fact, if you've ever heard of the Schofield Reference Bible, Schofield was the person who really popularized the concept of the rapture and developed the study Bible, the one with the footnotes all down the middle of the column there. He was a big believer in these extra dimensions. He said, quote, "We conclude, therefore, that a higher world than ours is not only conceivably possible, but probable. Secondly, that such a world may be considered as a world of 4 dimensions. And thirdly, that the spiritual world agrees largely in its mysterious laws, with what, by analogy, would be the laws, language, and claims of a 4th dimension." What he's saying is that all that weird stuff you read about in the Bible, if you start to think about it, maybe this 4th dimension stuff could help explain some of that. Makes sense, doesn't it? Well, again, the idea was popular. People thought it was kind of cool. Theologians debated it, and then it kind of lapsed for a while. And then came a book that became a bestseller and really put this idea of the 4th dimension on the map. Edwin Abbott was an English scholar who happened to have a passion for mathematics, and he loved this idea of extra dimensions. So he wrote a little book called Flatland. Now, the first half of the book is just a satire on Victorian society, which is actually quite funny, but that's not part of our story tonight. What is the second half. You see, in this story, Mr. Square is living his 2-dimensional life. Just, going about his ordinary 2-dimensional life. And then one evening, while he's sitting about in his 2-dimensional living room in his 2-dimensional house, going about his ordinary 2-dimensional life, he starts, getting this kind of weird feeling, and he tells his wife, "Do you feel like there's something here?" And his wife, "Whatever. No, of course, no. What? Do you see anything?" "No." Well, his wife goes off, and then it happens. Something appears in front of Mr. Square. Now, to make it short, it's Mr. Sphere. And Mr. Sphere says, "I come from a higher dimension." And Mr. Sphere says, "I've come to bring you a message. I want you to share it with your fellow 2-dimensional flatlanders," hence the title. And Mr. Square is like, "There's no 3rd dimension. I'm sorry, no, there's no 3rd dimension. Do you see a 3rd dimension around?" No, there's two dimensions. So they go back and forth, Mr. Sphere and Mr. Square. Mr. Sphere tries logic. Doesn't work. He tries telling Mr. Square all kinds of things that Mr. Sphere couldn't know. You interviewed the neighbors. Back and forth, back and forth. Well, Mr. Square begins to suspect, because, people just don't appear out of nowhere. that I don't know, something a little dodgy about this guy. Now, in this flatland, isosceles triangles, because they're uneven angles, are the criminal class. So finally, Mr. Square gets tired of all this and tackles, literally, tackles Sphere. "Fool, madman, irregular," I exclaimed. "Never will I release thee. Thou shalt pay the penalty of thine impostures." Remember, this is the late 19th century, so, yeah. And Sphere has had it. I tried. "Ha! Is it come to this?" thundered the stranger. "Then meet your fate. Out of your plane you go. Once, twice, thrice, 'tis done." And then Square says, "An unspeakable horror seized me. There was a darkness, then a dizzy, sickening sensation. Of sight there was not like seeing. I saw a line that was no line. Space, there was not space. I was myself, but not myself. When I could find voice, I shrieked aloud in agony. Either this is madness or it is hell." "It is neither," calmly replied the voice of the sphere. "It is knowledge. It is 3 dimensions. Open your eyes once again and try to look steadily." I looked, and behold, a new world. There stood before me, visibly incorporate, so embodied, all that I had before inferred, conjectured, dreamed, of perfect circular beauty. So Sphere teaches them all about the 3rd dimension. Square goes back home to spread the message, and you'll have to read the book to find out what happens. Sorry, no spoilers here. Flatland became a bestseller, and as you can see, it's still in print today. And I forgot to mention a little something. Edwin Abbott was the Reverend Edwin Abbott. He was an Anglican clergyman. So let's think about that for just a moment. A creature that suddenly appears out of nowhere, burst into a person's ordinary life, says, "I come from some place you can't even imagine. I have a message for you," that upends this person's life. At first they try to deny it, argue against it, but then they're overwhelmed when they see the proof of it, and it changes their life and affects how they act with others. Does this sound a little familiar? I think it's time we need to turn off the lights and get talking about some holy goosebumps.